All right, welcome back to the Flowage Podcast, everybody. We've got so much to cover today in this episode, we've got to get right into it. And if you're following along in this mini-series on what the hell, this is episode 11. We're on that topic. We are into the book of Revelation, and we're rereading, actually the entire book, through a nonviolent, Jesus-centered, Jesus-crucified lens. That's going to lay the foundation for us to view many of the passages that are used to support the traditional view of hell in a completely different light. So hell might exist in like this basic framework of the idea, that God is going to come face to face with evil and sin and sinners at final judgment when Jesus returns. But I am challenging what that's going to look like regarding violence and God dishing out punishments, and I'm going to be even challenging what that might look like into an eternity. So stick with me as we're starting to go through this book, because it's all going to come to a head when we get to the final chapters in Revelation, and we'll get around to the topic of the lake of fire and the white throne of judgment and the new Jerusalem that descends from heaven and all the kings of the earth that are, receiving final judgment at the end of the age, and so on. So we're going to get to that, but let's get into our episode for the day. Now, last time we went over the first 4 trumpets that are blown in Revelation chapter 8. And within all those 4 trumpets, what we saw was a signature. The signature of the 1/3. As each trumpet was blown, we saw different disasters befalling the earth. And in every one of them, what was being affected was described as 1/3. 1/3 of the earth being burned up, 1/3 of the sea becoming blood, 1/3 of the rivers turning poisonous, and 1/3 of the sun and stars being darkened, and so on. And then we looked at chapter 12 and saw how it was the dragon who swept 1/3 of the stars from heaven down to earth. And that 1/3, that doesn't represent some type of numerical value that we need to calculate and figure out and put on some calendar or a timeline. But no, it's a number that's associated with identity. Not a calendar or a date, but it's identity. The 1/3 in chapter 12, with the dragon sweeping all the stars down, it reveals the identity. And we know that's the dragon, Satan. And because he's the 1/3, that ties all of this catastrophic disaster and evils that are happening in chapter 8 when these first 4 trumpets are blown to Satan, to himself and his evil kingdom, and not from God. This helped us re-understand that chapter 8, it's not showing the evil and destruction that God is going to send via wrath and via retribution and vengeance upon the earth against sinners at the end times. But no, it's revealing all the evil and ugly works that Satan and his kingdom of darkness have been doing and is doing now and is going to continue to do with increasing more and more intensity as we progress towards Jesus' return. Chapter 8 isn't prophesying about some future events that are going to occur as if we should look for those events and then stick them on our calendar and mark them off when they take place. No, these first 4 trumpets are exposing and they're revealing the ancient serpent's evil work that comes from his cloud of heavenly and cosmic chaos. That's a mouthful, but those are 2 paragraphs you can take to the bank. Now, in that last episode, we also explored Revelation chapter 13, and we saw that Satan, it's him, the dragon, who also empowers 2 other beasts, who together with him form this demonic anti-trinity, which it's another signature move of Satan. It's his MO. He impersonates, he imposters, and tries to be like God as he tries to ascend and be just like him. Man, that last episode was super powerful. I'm still pumped up from it, so definitely check that out if you haven't yet, because we're going to build upon all that and what was already discussed, especially when we discussed chapter 6 with the breaking of the 4 seals and all the horsemen of the apocalypse. So we're building all this one thing upon another. Therefore, if we combine what we saw from those first seals that we looked at and now these 4 trumpets that have been blown, it clearly portrays Satan as an additional actor in heaven who's under his own authority and power, independent of God and independent of God's sovereignty, who's wreaking havoc upon the earth. That's what we've seen so far. Revelation is revealing all this stuff. Jesus, who's the slain lamb, is revealing this so that we get the inside scoop to the condition of our world as it exists now. As we progress through the book of Revelation, Jesus is also going to reveal how he's going to deal with this problem of evil and all of Satan's works at his second coming and in judgment. We haven't got to that stuff yet, but right now the Lamb is just revealing all of what's going on. So that's where we are up to this point. And now as we move forward with today's episode, and we've got this backstory, that helps us set the foundation for how we're going to view God dealing with humankind at the end of the age, when we have this resurrection and judgment stuff and what all this means concerning hell. We're just trying to get our foundation laid. It's all super important stuff, guys, and now we're going to dig into our content for today. The last chapter of chapter 8, the last verse of chapter 8, right where we stopped, John sees an eagle in his vision right after these first 4 trumpets are revealed. And the eagle says, 3 woes are coming as the next 3 trumpets are about to blow. 3 woes. With each of these 3 woes, each one new woe with each new trumpet, right? So today we're going to cover just the first 2 woes, and this is going to take us a while. It'll take us up through chapter 9, up through chapter 11, verse 14. The third woe that we're not doing is all the revelation that John gives about the dragon and about Satan and the 2 beasts that Satan empowers, who rise up out of both the sea and the earth, which happens in chapters 12 and 13 there. So we're going to cover those chapters on the next episode, and hopefully, if we have the time, to get into chapter 14. And because that chapter 14 is the first chapter that really directly addresses what we think of hell and judgment in the fate and the afterlife of people who are maybe opposed to God in this life. So chapter 14, that's really the first place in Revelation where John starts adding in pictures and symbolism about final judgment. So guys, hang on, we're getting really close to diving into some of that hell content in Revelation. But we need the backstory that comes first, guys. So I'm laying down that now so we have this framework for where we're going, so we're not just trying to explain those passages out of thin air, because it's all in context. So, all right, the first woe, guys, begins when the angel blows the 5th trumpet. This is the opening of chapter 9. Verse 1 through 11 say this, so it's quite a long passage here. It says, "And the 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth. And the star was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened in the smoke, from the smoke of the shaft. And then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power, like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only harm the people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were allowed to torment them 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people are going to seek death and not find it. They're going to long to die, but death will not flee from them. In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. And their faces were like human faces, and their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates, like breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots and horses rushing into battle. They have tails and stingers like scorpions, and their power was to hurt people for 5 months, and it was in their tails. And they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. And his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek it is Apollyon. Guys, there's so much here to unpack. And we could do 10 episodes on these 11 verses. And I've got to be real strategic on what I want to bring out in this first woe and how that's going to impact how we imagine God, evil, and violence. And this is because of the traditional view of hell imagines God as being someone who is all too comfortable with carrying out violence on evildoers. That's how we imagine God. As if the most holy and righteous response to evil is to respond with more evil and more violence. It's not violence and evil if it's for the right cause, right? That's how we imagine God. And of course, Revelation is used as the proof text to show this, that this is exactly how God's going to carry out final judgment at the end times. As some of the content that I just read from that passage, that must be God that's doing the torturing and allowing these weird scorpion-looking locust beasts that have scorpion tails and look like horsemen and stuff. There must be God doing it. He's getting vengeance finally. But in my presentation of the first 8 chapters, we haven't seen any type of violence or bloodshed or torture or calamities in the book of Revelation being attributed to God. All the violence and horror has been Satan and his kingdom. And this first woe is no exception here with this first trumpet, or this 5th trumpet. Now, you have to kind of have that passage next to you if you're kind of going to follow along, unless you got a really good memory. But first of all, when that 5th angel blows his trumpet, the text said, a star fell from heaven to earth. And we've already covered how in chapter 12, it's the dragon. Satan is the one who flings the stars down to earth, and not God. So don't be confused just because you see a star flung, quote, from heaven, unquote, and go on think that it's God in heaven who is sending the star. No, guys, this is one of Satan's fallen stars, and Satan who is doing it of his own power and authority. Next, it is said that the star was given the key to the bottomless pit, which, as I mentioned with those first 4 trumpets, this statement is in the passive voice. It was given. It doesn't say God gave it or King Tut gave it. It says was given. It's a poetic way of doing it, and it adds a little mystery and intrigue to the text, just like a good novel or storybook does. It kind of keeps you engaged with the text. So, and there's no need to assume that God gave this key so that God can unleash wrath and vengeance and get payback through Satan. Not at all. Remember, as we already looked in chapter 12 from previous episodes, Satan also has power. He's got authority, and he, just like God, Satan gives it to whoever he wants. We covered all that on past episodes. Just like Jesus was taken to a high mountain during his temptation in the wilderness, and Satan said, I'll give you all this. It's mine to give. God had nothing to do with it. Satan can empower and give away authority in the same manner. And Satan is not acting on behalf of God, nor is he God's agent of evil. He's not on God's blacklisted private payroll. Nor is this bottomless pit that the key opens some place that God sends people there so he can torture them. This is not some black site that's off the grid that God uses to punish. The bottomless pit is the realm of Satan and the symbolic place where all evil and violence originates from, and it's due to cosmic, demonic rebellion. That's what that is, guys. Verse 2 goes on to say that the smoke that arises from the bottomless pit is like a furnace. Notice that furnace is a place of burning, and it's all related to Satan's realm. Because that's what Satan realms it entails. It's his signature. It's the origin that comes from all this region. It's the result of Satan's works is a smoke, not God's. God's not the one who creates the smoke or the burning furnace. It's Satan. And you also notice in verse 2 that John uses the active voice now, that the opening of the bottomless pit with a fire It's not God. It's directly cited as being done by this fallen demonic star that is in the heavenly realm. What you have here is a mic drop moment that directly correlates the opening of the pit to Satan and his kingdom of darkness. From that smoke, then, so this is first you got the pit opened and the smoke, and now comes locusts out of the smoke, which are like a swarm of grasshoppers. That's what locust is. Not all grasshoppers are locusts, but that's our imagination. It's in this swarm. It's not a beautiful depiction of animals, but it's this demonic alteration. It's an unnatural mutation, something that shouldn't happen. I mean, these things are nasty. They've been twisted and distorted and mutated by Satan's evil kingdom. And again, you see in the passive voice there, it says that they were given power in verse 3. No, it doesn't say that God was the one that gave these locusts the authority and empowered them. Heck no. They all come from the demonic realm of the abyss. That's where they receive their power from, the devil himself. Just like the beasts receive power from the devil himself in chapter 13. We see that passive voice being used again in the next 3 verses when it describes what these locusts are empowered to do. I'll read them again just to refresh us. It's verse 4. These locusts now, they were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or tree, but only those people who didn't have the seal of God on their foreheads. I wonder who told them that. It wasn't God. They were allowed, there's that passive voice again, to torment for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, they will seek death, but not find it. They will long to die, but death will not flee from them. See, you got that passive voice there in verse 4. It says they were told. And in verse 5 it says they were allowed. That passive voice, it allows the reader to conclude, using context and other information, who did the action. And given what we've already seen in previous chapters, folks, we can be assured that the one who's doing this work is the kingdom of darkness. And what does the kingdom of darkness do? Well, that passage I just reread says they torment. They torture. Torment and torture come from Satan. They do not come from God. God never tortures or torments people. Never. Nor do I believe that anything like that is going to come at the resurrection from the hand of God. That is not how God deals with evil and violence. That's not his signature. He doesn't retaliate with violence. That is the devil. But some people continue to assert that this 5th trumpet with the torturing locusts is an act of God, who's sovereignly giving the command to these demonic agents to do it, or passively allowing Satan to do these things. You're just kind of sitting there, But let me read you what it says at the end of that passage. After giving a description of what these locusts look like and how nasty they are, we read in verse 11 that it says, they have king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek his name is Apollyon. The king that these hideous, locust-like creatures have over them is not God in heaven. That's not their king. He's not the one giving the orders. God is not their ruler. He's not deciding what happens and doesn't happen. God's not the one who has to answer for this stuff. He's not the one that they're subject to. Jesus has no association with them concerning his rule, reign, or sovereignty. He's not standing there going, just go and do it. I'll permit it. Rather, the Greek and Hebrew words that verse 11 uses there, Abaddon and Apollyon, are both translated as the destroyer. Now, I do have to comment on this word destroyer for a second. We've already seen the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the first 4 seals destroying the earth. That's what they did. We've already seen the first 4 trumpets revealing all the destruction that happens on the earth and in the heavens with that 1/3 signature. In all these cases of destruction, the destruction has been coming from Satan, not God. And though they've all been presented to us in the passive voice, and up to now no name has been identified with them, aha! The name Destroyer has been given here. It's like a good book, it slowly reveals. Now I do want to tip my hat to the fact that there's a few passages in the Old Testament that seem to portray God as being the destroyer by name, or associates that to him. And for example, when the last plague strikes the Egyptians in the book of Exodus, if I remember right, there's 10 of them, the whole Passover narrative associates the murdering of this firstborn that comes with this plague coming at the hands of God, with that name, the destroyer, being in that passage. And it kind of seems as though it represents him, that he's the destroyer. And it's very easy to come to that conclusion, so I want to acknowledge that if you're just reading that one little story by itself. But you see, I also want to acknowledge that what I've been saying throughout this entire podcast, up to these 48, 49 episodes we were up to at this point, and I know it's the umpteenth time that I'm probably saying this, but I've already talked about how to understand the Old Testament violence and bloodshed when it gets attributed to God in the light of the truth that Jesus revealed about the very real cosmic battle going on between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. Because Jesus hit the reset button on our whole understanding of who God is, at his nature and his character, especially concerning violence. So before we go on believing that this passage here in Revelation chapter 9 with the locusts and the fifth trumpet is trying to somehow portray God as the destroyer here who is destroying the earth, remember, it was Jesus who said in John chapter 10 that it's the thief who comes to kill, steal, and destroy, which is Satan, not God. And when Revelation does speak of God getting vengeance on the earth, I want you to hear whom God is getting vengeance upon. These are verses 17 and 18 later in the same chapter. The elders in heaven are rejoicing in worship to God, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord, O God Almighty, the one who is, who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. The nations were angry. Your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." The elders in heaven, guys, are rejoicing because God's defeat of evil and violence, they're finally being revealed, and they're finally coming forth. The elders are now seeing it, and they are rejoicing. They're rejoicing because God is finally out to destroy who? Those who destroy the earth. That's what that last sentence said of verse 18. Now, if you're thinking that God's the one who caused the four horsemen to destroy the earth, and God's the one who's behind the first four trumpets where 1/3 of the earth is in the heavens are destroyed, then verse 17 through 18 is saying that the elders are rejoicing that God is finally destroying himself, right? That God is destroying they who destroy the earth, which would be, well, his own evil minions of death. That's what you have to believe if you're interpreting that content, including this fifth trumpet here with the locust, as being from God. And that seems like pretty ridiculous theology, no matter how crazy you try and do theological acrobatics around that. No, folks, none of that stuff that destroys the earth comes from God at all. Not one piece of it. God is a healer. He's a restorer. He's the one that brings life. He doesn't take it. He's one of forgiving hope and brings relief to suffering. Not one that induces it or uses it as a punishment or some type of retribution. So that's what I want to say about the destroyer. Yet, there are those who would still take this passage and argue against what I've just said by pointing to verse 4. That verse said this about the locusts. The locusts were told to not harm the grass of the earth or given any plant or tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. You see, people from the other camp say verse 4, it's another proof text, because it shows that God is getting retribution on evildoers. Because the verse says, they were told to only harm those who do not have the seal on their heads, right? Therefore, some people have taken that to mean that God is releasing these locusts in a similar way to when the 10th plague on Egypt was released. You know, they imagine God who's doing the destroying on those who do evil and have the mark of the beast, you know, and he's getting retribution on them, but he's sovereignly saving those who have God's seal, which is similar to the Israelites in Egypt who had to spread the lamb's blood on their doorposts. And sure, that's one way you could look at this whole first woe. But I want to give you an alternate interpretation, which all leads into how God deals with and eradicates evil. We're going to be talking a lot more about this and making frequent reference to this mechanism as we move deeper into the book of Revelation and we review the passages where John, writes out these visualizations of God's judgment. Okay, God's method of dealing with evil is implosion. That's how God eradicates, deals with, and judges evil. To show you this, I want to read you now a passage from Isaiah chapter 14. Now, over church history, this has been interpreted as a prophetic passage. Although Isaiah is addressing, his little prophetic utterance here to the king of Babylon, which is a city, old ancient city, kind of in the country of, or south of Baghdad, Iraq, by about 50 miles or so. The church history believes that Isaiah is really talking about Satan and the cosmic battle that he's been raging against God in the heavenlies. Now I'm only going to read part of this passage, so you can read the whole of all of it in context if you'd like to on your own. But pay attention to the very last verse that comes at the end concerning what the king of Babylon does to his own people. How have you fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn? You've been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. That sounds like what we just read about the falling star in Revelation. Verse 13, you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of the assembly and on the utmost high of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the top of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. But you are going to be brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Lots of Revelation imagery in here, right? It's where John is borrowing this material from. Verse 16, those who see you when you've been brought low, they ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth, who made the kingdoms tremble? The man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home? All the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out of your tomb and rejected like a branch. You are covered with the slain and with those pierced by the sword, those who descend to the stones of the pit. Like a corpse trampled underfoot, you will not join them in burial. For you have destroyed your land, and you have killed your people. The connection to God's mechanism for bringing judgment here, guys, it's in that characteristic here of this king of Babylon, and that he destroys his own land and kills his own people. Are you seeing this? If this often, this passage is often accredited with being a prophetic passage concerning Satan, with Satan being this morning star that has fallen from heaven, then one of the principal characteristics of Satan's evil kingdom is that he destroys the very geography, and the people within his rule. And that, folks, is exactly what the fifth trumpet is revealing when it says in verse 4 that the king of the locusts, who is Satan, tells them will only torture the people who don't have God's mark. Because Satan is doing the same thing he does, taking the people in his dominion, his reign, his authority, and he's destroying them. He's tormenting them, torturing them. He's doing it to his own people. It's the same thing we saw in the first four seals with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And in the first four trumpets, in that Satan is destroying the earth. It's his realm. When he took Jesus up on the mountain, he owns all the kingdoms of the earth. He's destroying his own land. That's what Satan does, and that's what Revelation 11, 17 through 18 showed that I read a minute ago, where the elders are rejoicing because finally God is going to destroy the destroyer. And while I'm at it here, notice that it's the destroyer who releases these locusts, who in this fifth trumpet is the leader, commanding them to torment his own people for 5 months, but not to kill them. Whose torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And going on to say that in those days, those people are going to seek death and not find it. They're going to long to die, but death will flee for them. I mean, wow. To seek death and not find it? To long to die and you're not able to? Well, that sounds exactly like the traditional view of hell that often gets attributed to God, doesn't it? To torture and not be able to die? To seek death and not find it? Notice, though, that is not God's way of dealing with the opposition. This is Satan's way and how he rules his kingdom, just as Isaiah prophesied. Satan destroys his own land and kills his own people. If there's any torturing going on, it's not being done at the hands of God. Never. Now, what is God's response to dealing with this evil and this demonic king and kingdom? Well, I don't believe it's how we've been traditionally led to believe, and that God just uses more violence to get rid of violence. And that God uses more evil to dispel evil. Instead, I use that word implosion. That's the methodology of God's judgment that I'm going to be using for the rest of the book of Revelation, and how I believe God brings final judgment to these evil powers. And I'm going to be slowly sharing more and more verses and passages that demonstrate how God's kingdom operates like this, and how it will be operating like this as we come to the later passages in the book of Revelation. But I wanted to mention that one other spot right here that correlates, this Isaiah 14 passage, and how even in the Old Testament it's prophesying that this is how Satan's fallen kingdom responds or does to its own subjects. Let me keep going on this implosion idea. There's another chapter in the Old Testament that is also attributed to being a prophetic passage talking about Satan. This is Ezekiel chapter 28. So you got Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28. And I don't have time to read this one in full either, but in this particular passage, the author is addressing judgment to the king of Tyre. But church tradition also attributes this to being a prophetic judgment against and a description about Satan's kingdom and his impending doom. The rant describes how this king was created in glory, but then became haughty and prideful and fell. Kind of how we just read Isaiah 14 the same way. And embedded in this text, in verse 18, it says this about Satan's soon coming destruction. It says, "So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you." And you can read that in context to see what I'm talking about. But guys, this might be one of the most important things I'm bringing out in this entire series of Revelation that we've gone through up to this point. Ezekiel uses fire the imagery of fire for God's judgment. But notice where the fire comes from. Yes, the judgment comes from God, so you can see that it is a divine judgment. But the fire, as Ezekiel says, comes from within. It comes from the destroying king himself. It's his own fire that consumes him. You see, this is God's methodology of judgment. It's evil imploding upon itself that brings the fallen demonic kingdom to its own doom. That is how God deals with cosmic evil, bloodshed and violence. He allows it to collapse upon itself, just like Jesus allowed it to collapse upon himself on the cross. And in doing so, it brings ruin to itself. The kingdom comes to an end. Therefore, when we come to the fifth trumpet, in chapter 9 here, where it shows Satan, the ruler of the bottomless pit, who gives instructions to these menacing locusts to torment people who are not sealed by God. And these people that are sealed, they still meet their end. They're called martyrs. They die at the hands of that. Don't let that come off to you as if that is God allowing Satan to torture non-believers because of their sin. Hardly. The fifth trumpet is God revealing to us readers of Revelation the absolute ugliness and wretchedness of this rogue and evil king who destroys his own land and his own people. We just read that from Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. And we're going to see that this letting go of evil's own free will is God's methodology to bringing this kingdom to an end via self-implosion, where fire is going to come out from this demonic kingdom from itself and consume itself to its own end. And amen and thank you, Jesus. Oh, that was such a mouthful, guys, and that's so much to chew on. We should end there, but I just want to finish up and get to this rest of this content because we want to get into the chapters 12, 13, and 14 next time. So hang on with me. You can press pause if you need to. Now, after the instigator of all this evil is named, the destroyer, right? Abaddon and Apollyon in verse 11. Verse 12 of chapter 9 now says that the first woe is done. Whew. Thank God. We saw that Satan is even more evil than we can even imagine. Now we're on to verse 13, where the sixth trumpet is blown at the beginning of the second woe. I'm saying all that because you got to keep it straight. It's hard for me to do that. Now, the second woe has two parts. Well, now we're getting more confused here. So here's the first part of the second woe. Verses 13 through 21, another long passage. It says this. Now the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and that day and that month and the year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of the mounted troops that must have been coming with these four demonic angels was twice 10,000 times 10,000. And I heard their number. And this is how I saw their horses in my vision of those who rode them. They wore breastplates, the color of fire and sapphire and of sulfur, and of the heads of the horses were like lions' heads. And fire, smoke, and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads. And by means of them they wound. The rest of the mankind that was not killed by these plagues, they did not repent of their works of their hands, nor gave up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or walk. Nor did they repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. Once again, there's so much in this passage. And we can only get to a few things because we've got a lot more to cover in this episode. So let me point out real quick here the obvious and easy stuff first. You'll notice that in both verse 15 and 18, the reference to the 1/3 is made. The fire, the smoke, and the sulfur plagues all have Satan's demonic signature attached with them. So clearly, John is revealing to us that through this 6th trumpet blast, that this is not the work of God. It's the work of the dragon. But I bet you picked that up on your own. And I also want to point to the methodology that Satan uses with fire, the smoke and the sulfur. Often, and the fire. Often those three images are attributed to God because there's, plenty of places in the Bible where God is, he's associated with those images. But as I've been continuing to mention this series of Revelation, we have to be very careful with discerning the actions being described and to whom and by what manner those actions are actually coming from. Yeah, in some places of the Bible, God gets a credit with fire, smoke, and sulfur. But in this passage, it's the 1/3. It's Satan. And although you might be conditioned to see fire, smoke, and sulfur as some type of vindictive or retributive justice of God, this passage will make you think twice about it because it's clearly the work of Satan terrorizing the earth and humanity. These three plagues, fire, smoke, and sulfur, they come from the demonic realm. Unless you're also reading Revelation with the understanding that Satan's kingdom, has power and authority. And that Satan is in a very real cosmic war with God. Because if you see it that way, well then you're going to very easily accredit these works to Satan. But don't be fooled. Don't let that go over your head. You can see right through it. It's got Satan's signature all over it. So that's what John's trying to communicate to us. As this 6th trumpet peels back another layer and exposes all the demonic work that Satan does, has done, and continues to do. That last section there in verses 20 and 21 about the rest of humanity that was not killed, that did not repent of their works, that's not a statement made to say that God sent this evil as some kind of warning so that people repent. And now John's saying, well, they didn't repent after God sent these plagues. No, this is saying that despite all the evil that Satan does on the earth, it's just surprising, mind-blowing, that humanity stays in allegiance and in lordship to Satan. I mean, it just blows your mind, boggles it. And we see this happening in real life all the time. We see people addicted to drugs and pornography and alcohol. And that causes terrible problems in their own lives. Destroys them from the inside out. I should know. I've dealt with all three of those things in my own life. And all of us who have junk in our life know that these things destroy our lives and causes more problems than good. And people who love us are standing by on the outside, scratching their heads going, why do they keep doing it to themselves? How come all the garbage that comes in their life as a result of their behaviors doesn't snap them out of it and make them turn away from it? And we wonder, how come all the people on the outside who aren't doing this stuff don't look at these guys and say, I'll never touch that. I don't want anything to do with that. And then more people get involved. It blows the mind. It's mind-boggling that our own consequences befall us doesn't detract other people. Maybe it does for some, but a lot of people just get caught up in it just the same. But guys, that's the nature of deception. It always has the appearance of good, but it ends up being evil. And we get so addicted to the immediate gratification that we can't even see the forest of the trees. We don't even know what's happening to us. It's the same thing with that demonic kingdom of darkness. We saw how the fallen star opens the bottomless pit and how the locusts come out and destroy all the people who don't have the seal of God on their foreheads. It's the strangest thing, you would think that the people who see all this destruction come upon would say, oh man, I don't want that to happen to me, but you get caught up in it yourself. That's what the kingdom of darkness does, everybody. It doesn't make any logical sense. So those are more of the easier parts to get through on this first part of the second woe. But the next part that trips a lot of people up from that passage here is where it says, a voice from heaven tells the sixth angel who blows the trumpet to release the four angels who were bound at the great river Euphrates. On first glance, you might think, well, God has placed these angels at this symbolic river, this Euphrates River that's so central to the Bible. And that's God's angels here who are bringing retribution and punishment to the earth. And of course, this again is used many times as a proof text to show how God unleashes violence from his own hand and from his own heavenly angels of doom and destruction as a part of his judgment. And for another tip of the hat, I do want to notice the contrast that we saw from chapter 7 during the sixth seal, where we kind of have the same scene going on there, where there's, four angels standing at the four corners of the earth holding back demonic winds that are trying to bring destruction to the earth. That's what we saw back then. But what you see here in chapter 9 is not a holding back, but it's in this second woe with the sixth trumpet, it's a releasing. So there's a noticeable contrast here. So let me address those contrasts for just a second. When we covered that chapter 7 passage with the four winds, I talked about how that holding back, that's a reference to spiritual warfare, and that's going on in the heavenly and the cosmic realm. To say one is holding back, that's the language John used. That's his way of saying that heaven is in a battle against something and actively working against something in prevention. That's all that means. God is fighting against something. He's holding back. But as a contrast, we see in chapter 9 here a voice saying to release these angels at the river Euphrates. I mean, what's going on here? Well, first of all, we know Satan and his kingdom have their own underlings and imps and demons and demonic agents of evil. We already know that. So to say that you're releasing something means that you have been in a position of holding back already, right? So contrasting chapter 7's holding back with chapter 9's releasing is saying that there's been a grand cosmic battle going on between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light, where in times past, God has been actively fighting against them. But now the time has come for God's judgment, where God lets go. We talked about this letting go in past episodes, and that's the methodology and what the wrath of God means. I'm not going to go over all that again, but what we see happening in Revelation chapter 9 here with the releasing of these four angels, these four angels at the river Euphrates, they're demonic workers of darkness who have been engaged in battle with the forces of light. However, the time of judgment has arrived, and God's methodology for destroying these evil forces is now to release them and to let their own destructiveness ricochet back upon them, which will bring them to an end. Just as I mentioned with the fifth trumpet, this is God's methodology of implosion. The releasing of the four demonic angels is not God releasing punitive, retributive, or payback type of violence in an act of final judgment. It's an act of letting go, so that evil runs rampant and that it collapses in upon itself. And I agree. What we see here with the sixth trumpet marks a change in John's tone, where in past chapters he's gone from revealing what Satan is doing to now exposing how God is going to be dealing with the works of Satan at final judgment. John has been exposing Satan's actions, and now we're seeing a glimpse of God's reaction to Satan. John's been giving us an expose of all the evil that the evil servant does. He's not been giving us an expose of divine retribution and judgment. He's now starting to move over from just showing and revealing Satan's works to revealing God's response to them. And we're going to see more and more of God's responses to Satan as we move beyond even chapter 14. We get into the 7 bowls of wrath and what comes after that. So that's a little sneak peek of where we're going and how we're going to be interpreting those later passages. All right, that wraps up the activity of these 4 demonic angels. They're evil horsemen that comes with them that are released at this river Euphrates, and the 3 plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur, which finishes up chapter 9. Okay, we're done with that. Now, chapter 10 is a transition chapter. I'm not going to spend much time here because we've got a whole bonus episode that I'm going to do on it right in the next episode. So be ready for that one. It's all going to be around what chapter 10 sets up to be in verse 7 as the grand mystery of God. That's soon to be fulfilled when Jesus comes at his second return. And that bonus episode is really going to help us set up chapter 15 when we get to talking about the 7 bowls of wrath that comes after the 7th trumpet. And just a sneak peek, the mystery of God is all about non-violent response to evil. God's non-violent response to evil. Which I know seems like complete nonsense to human beings who are altogether conditioned to overcome evil with more evil and violence and with more violence. But that's why it's called the mystery of God here in Revelation and other parts of the Old Testament. So we're going to be using a lot of Old Testament scripture in that bonus episode and lining that up with the person of Jesus to reveal the mystery of God. One little thing I do want to bring up about chapter 10 is about what happens to this little scroll that's in this chapter. You know, the chapter starts out where an angel is holding a little scroll in his hand. And later on, when you read the chapter, a voice from heaven tells John to take the scroll from the angel and eat it, which is a reference to another Old Testament book where the same thing happens, which I know is weird. It sounds like John's on a psychedelic trip, but I love what the result turns out to be. Verse 10 says that John took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. And goes on to say that it was sweet like honey in his mouth, but when he ate it, his stomach was made bitter. Now I tell you what, guys, if that doesn't sum up the entirety of the kingdom of darkness, I don't know what does. That's exactly what the deception of the enemy does. It looks good on the outside. Even tastes good in your mouth. And initially it slides down your throat, but man, after you eat it, it makes you sick. And from that, I can launch into a whole tirade, but I'm not going to. All right, that finally brings us into chapter 11, where verses 1 through 14 gives us part 2 of the second woe. You can put it on pause if we're covering too much. A lot in this episode, but we got to move through this book of Revelation. All right, the first part of the second woe, those were the 4 demonic angels that were released at the river Euphrates with their horsemen of evil. And then we had the intermediary chapter 10. That was the first part of the second woe. Now, the second part of the woe is here. Hey, we're still on the 6th trumpet, guys. 6th trumpet blew, and now we're getting the second woe. And we're trying to keep with the theme of this mini-series, which we're looking for a more Jesus-looking picture of hell than what we're traditionally given, which is normally eternal conscious torment. And this chapter 11 here, this second part of the second woe, it's more like a one-off in that grand scheme, because there's not really here, a lot about hell, so you could skip it, turn the rest of this episode off. But I want to, for those of you that want to go deeper, I want to give you a real quick summary and point out a few things as we finish this episode. The main point I want to bring out about chapter 11 is that John refers to a lot of Old Testament content here, which, in my opinion, John isn't doing that so that he's prophesying about future events, but he's retelling the same cosmic battle between the Lamb and the serpent through two Old Testament figures and those Old Testament ideas. John uses characters from the Old Testament to tell the same story of the crucified Messiah, but uses them instead of Jesus. Kind of uses them as our symbol as martyrs and as prophets. Perhaps the significance in doing this is to ground his book with the traditions and the legacy of the Old Testament, bringing the Bible full circle. Not exactly sure why he does this or needs to do this, but this can be some great food for thought if you want to explore this on your own. So I'll just read this passage in entirety, and I'm going to interject along the way. Verses 1 through 2 of chapter 11 say, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told to rise up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Now, there's a lot about measuring in the book of Ezekiel between chapters 40 and 48. See this exact type of measuring going on there. It's quite extensive. And what does this measuring symbolize? Well, a lot of scholars and academics will tell you that it's not really with trying to come up with a number or trying to figure out the physical space or the accuracy of accounting. It's symbolic. It symbolically represents a permanent state of being of God, a safe place, a place of order that God has established that no one can break. So telling John to measure it, the temple, is like telling someone, hey man, this whole place is yours now. Go ahead, start measuring it for the furniture that you want to put in it. This is a safe place I've established. It's all yours. And specific for John here, it says that he was told to also measure the people who were around the altar, which is a confirmation that there is going to be vindication in a continuing story for those who remained faithful to God in the midst of all this damage and death that Satan's kingdom has brought upon them, and even in the giving over of their lives. Even though they die physically, even though they have the mark on their head, they still die physically. But their soul is saved, and they have a place in the heavenly kingdom in the temple. So go ahead and measure it. The next section gets a little controversial here as to what John is trying to speak about. This is verses 3 through 5. And I'll grant my authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. Again, 3.5 years. Clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. And if anyone harms them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. Now, the church background I came out of as a kid was big on end-time prophecies, man, in the book of Revelation. And the short of it is that, man, our church even thought that maybe one of our leaders was one of these 2 witnesses, that there's real 2 witnesses that are going to come to earth, physical people, and they're going to prophesy and say, God's end is near, and they're going to, inflict all this wrath and violence and bloodshed. I have a lot of literalist friends because of my ultra-conservative background, that would bash me for taking any type of conclusion that didn't assert that these 2 witnesses are real people that God is going to send to the earth. You can set your watch to, mark it on your calendar, it's going to happen. Literal fulfillment. But my opinion is this is symbolic language. Because look at the next 2 verses. They have the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Power to prevent the sun from raining or the sky from raining. Power to turn water to blood. These aren't real people. These are symbolic references to both Elijah, who prophesied the sky would not rain when he prophesied against Ahab in 1 Kings 17, and Moses, who you will remember brought a plague against Egypt by turning their waters to blood. So that's all I'm going to say about that. We could do a whole episode or two on these two witnesses, but let me just point out in these three verses, these verses 3 through 6, real quick here, that the passage starts off with saying that these two witnesses are the two lampstands. Now, a lampstand is like a candle holder or a holder that holds the oil for burning of a lamp. That's what they would have used back in the Old Testament. Now, if you're thinking in biblical terms, imagine like a candelabra looking thing that has 7 holders for 7 candles or oil lamps. That's how God instructed the Israelites at Mount Sinai to make a lampstand. If you read the book of Genesis or Exodus, they got 7 holders. And if you look at any imagery when the nation of Israel is portrayed, you often see like a lampstand or a menorah on there, even to this day. Now, this image of lampstands and olive trees, this is taken from Zechariah chapter 4. Go ahead and read that. We'll look into that more on our bonus episode. But Revelation already tells us what lampstands symbolize way back in chapter 1, verse 20, where the 7 lampstands John saw in his vision are the 7 churches to which he's writing this book of Revelation to. So this is simple. Lampstands are groups of people, or just people who represent the slaughtered, non-violent Lamb, who represent him not by power, not by force, not by might, but by the Spirit of God. Just as Zechariah says in that chapter 4 passage. But I'll talk about that more in that bonus episode. But identifying the two witnesses as the 2 lampstands and olive trees ensures that non-violence is built right into the text from the very get-go, because it's all in the context of not by power, not by might. Get it? Imagine that in a context of non-violence. You're not using your power over it, but it's done by the Spirit of God. More of that on the bonus episode. So what I think John is doing here, he's using the most prominent figures of his Hebrew Bible, Moses and Elijah, and retelling the story of the people who faithfully follow the slaughtered lamb that witnessed and displayed God to the world nonviolently through these famous Old Testament characters, who really is the church. The church is embodying these two witnesses. You see that nonviolence being displayed directly and how the two witnesses respond to whom they want to harm, or who want to harm them. It says in verse 5 that they issue fire from their mouths. That's what consumes their enemies. That's the same language we saw earlier episodes where Jesus had a sword from his mouth. It comes from his mouth. It's a mouth fire, mouth sword. It's truth. It brings truth, reveals truth. That's the burning. That's the revealing truth that nonviolence is used when it confronts evil and the forces of darkness. Now, what throws us off on this nonviolent take is in verse 6, where the two witnesses have the authority to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. Ooh, that sounds super violent, doesn't it? Every plague, but I want to remind you something here, because it says that they only have the authority to do it. It doesn't say they actually do anything with it, right? Remember, Jesus also said that he could have called down 10,000 angels when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. A plan that he could have violently overthrown the soldiers if he wanted to. Power is never anything that God lacks. But power over, with violence or coercion, that's not his nature. That's not his methodology, and that's not his response to evil. So no, there's no mention of these two witnesses pouring out these plagues on the earth. even though it says they might have retained the power. Remember too, when Elijah called down fire from heaven to kill soldiers violently, he got rebuked for it. And also when God told Elijah to meet him when Elijah was hiding in a cave, God wasn't in the fire or in any of the other powerful, violent-looking manifestations like the great wind or the earthquake. Instead, it was the still, small voice. This is exactly how Jesus came in his birth and his infancy, and how Jesus ministered on the earth and died on the cross in such a still, small voice. And that's how his followers spread his message, via non-violent witness. But if you're still thinking that this is going to be an actual violent warfare that these two witnesses use in their response to those who oppressed them, and that's how they're going to fight them off, notice what it says in verse 7. And when the two witnesses have finished their testimony, well, the beast that rises up from the bottom of the pit makes war on them and conquers them and kills them. So whatever violence these two witnesses are wielding, they get killed anyways. So apparently the power they had to unleash plagues and destroy people with fire from their mouths, it can't protect them against their own death anyways. So I suppose you can make some kind of argument that, they're allowed to act violently until, the time of their testimony is fulfilled. But we've already saw so much non-violent imagery up to this point in Revelation that is not very convincing for me to just all of a sudden, imagine God flipping and switching to violence and bloodshed just for these two witnesses for a short amount of time. It's not going to do it. No, rather, these two witnesses were embodying the same lives and ministry of Jesus. They're representations of the church. And this is how they are killed and how their deaths serve as non-violent witnesses to the gospel. All right, we're almost done with this little bit here of the second woe, and part 2 of the second woe. Picking up verse 8, it says, "And their bodies will lay in the streets of the great city," Jerusalem implied there, "that is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt," because Jerusalem is not representing, they've rebelled, "where their Lord was crucified. And for 3.5 days, some of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in the tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over these dead two witnesses and make merry and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth with the fire of their mouth." That's the torment, and they reveal and bring truth. Verse 11, "But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell upon all who saw them." So now we see the reverse happening. "And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, 'Come up here.' And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. And at that hour there was a great earthquake. 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were cast into fear and gave glory to the God of heaven." Now, just as Jesus died non-violently and then rose from the dead supernaturally, these two witnesses experienced the same phenomenon. But the last verse saying that it was only then, as a result of their non-violent testimony, that the rest of the people were filled with the reverential fear of God and turned and gave glory to God. Man, if the book were to end here, man, it seems as though their witness had a great effect on the world and brought salvation. One minute these bystanders are glorying in the fact that these two witnesses are dead, and the next minute they're raised from the dead, and the bystanders are now reverent towards God and giving him glory. I mean, that's the exact effect our nonviolent witness of the gospel of Jesus is supposed to do. And we are seeing it right here at the end of the story of the two witnesses. The last thing we're going to say about these two witnesses is that you probably noticed at the end there about the earthquake and the 7,000 being killed. Again, a lot of people say to me, "Gotcha. How are you going to explain that, Vinnie? God sent an earthquake and slaughtered 7,000 people, proving that God is violent in his judgment." Well, notice that the earthquake, it says an earthquake happened. It's in the passive voice again. is not being directly attributed to God's sovereign action as an instrument of his judgment. Violent, retributive judgment, that is. In my opinion, the earthquake happens organically as a result of the two witnesses rising up to heaven as their enemies watched. So what I believe is happening here is, as the nonviolent witness of Jesus is being revealed and displayed to the enemies in the symbolic story, evil implodes upon itself. It's actually the kingdom of darkness that gets shaken. And as a result of that kingdom losing power and collapsing in upon itself, that causes the earthquake and the deaths occur. Of course, I'm viewing all this as symbolic language and a symbolic story and not a real earthquake of 7,000 people being murdered. But that's one way to look at the last part of this passage that, at least on the surface, looks like it might implement God with being violent. And then verse 14 ends with this saying, "The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come." So that does it for today, folks. We've covered the first and second woes, the blowing of the fifth and sixth trumpets, and all that they revealed. And there's still one woe left to come, and that's the big one, guys. That's what we're going to cover next time when we pick back up on this series. But for now, be blessed.